I'm Jasmine Al-Gamal, and this is The View from Here. This week's view is from Syria, and we're going to be talking to Syrian researcher and analyst Orwa Ajjoub, who's currently doing his PhD in global politics at Malmö University in Sweden, and whose expertise is in jihadist groups as well as Syria. This is going to be a two-part episode because there's so much ground to cover on this topic. This week, we're going to be focusing on context and some of the history that led up to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and the rise of the current president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, before next week delving into some of the more current events, including the Alawite massacres on the coast of Syria in March of 2025, as well as the most recent massacres in the south in Suwaida. So without further delay, here's part one of my conversation with Orwa. Orwa Ajjoub, welcome to The View from Here.
Thank you for having me, Jasmine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me, Orwa. I've always found your analysis to be really nuanced and really thoughtful. And I think we really need those two things right now when it comes to Syria, because of everything that's going on, what you see in the news, what you've seen Syria go through. There's so much disinformation out there that I'm seeing, so much, taking sides and trying to frame the situation in right and wrong or good and bad. So I really wanted to have you on to try to help us sift through some of the events that have been happening in Syria, but not just recent events. I really want to zoom out a little bit and try to put everything that's happening in context. Tell us a little bit about, contextualize Syria for us as a country in the middle of this region, in the Middle East. Describe Syria and its positionality and its significance in terms of the Middle East, in terms of the region.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most important states geopolitically for everyone. It's situated between Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and to the north you have Turkey. It has access to the Mediterranean, and that's why the Russians were interested in basically taking this military base in Tartus. That allows them to project their power in the Mediterranean, so they can, stand as a major power, and say to the U.S. that this territory is contested. It's not only for you. And the NATO, of course, the NATO also wants to keep the Mediterranean under its influence through Turkey. And also through their bases in Cyprus. But so geopolitically, everyone is interested in Syria. And then when ISIS emerged, that was everyone wants to stop ISIS because ISIS was transnational. So if you remember 2014, when the US international coalition was established to combat ISIS, ISIS had already post control over a huge swath of territories between Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. So it was twice as big as the UK, and it was really big. So it was it was this strange transnational movement that managed to break the borders of Sykes-Picot that has been there since the 1920s. So it was really big, and everyone wants to contain this. And also, everyone wants to make sure that there is no threat on Israel. So the US only intervened in Syria basically to support Israel in this fight and to support its NATO ally, basically to minimize the refugees influx into Europe. So everyone was interested in Syria or a way or another. And of course, for Iran, it was the transit route to support Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, maybe Hamas in the region. So it was a corridor for also Iran and its project. China had also a foot in Syria through Assad. So if you think about it, everyone is interested for their own reasons to get hold or get a foot in Syria. And at a certain point, their agendas clashed, if you want to look from IR perspective, and we had the war.
Exactly. Everyone was interested in Syria, and everyone was impacted by what happened in Syria. Maybe you can start us out, Orwa, with just talking about, just taking us through recent history in Syria. Assad family rule from 1971 until Bashar al-Assad, the son, was overthrown in December of last year. the rise of Ahmed al-Sharaa, his transformation from al-Qaeda to Syria's president, and to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story to cover in one question. However, I'll try to. Assad's father came to power in the 70s, and then he worked hard on consolidating his rule, and by time he just eliminated his enemies and he ruled Syria with iron fist. And then he gave the throne to his son Bashar, who came to power, and he presented himself as a reformist who was who brought technology to Syria, who was more into liberalism, and there was this view about him that the guy who studied in London, so he has this Western views. He wanted to reform the country in a way or another.
And he had an English wife, and she was beautiful, and there was the sense that my gosh, I remember a Vogue article just before the Arab Spring talking about, Asma al-Assad as the rose in the desert, and how they were hanging out with Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, and the world was really enamored with that couple for a while.
Yeah, like very Orientalist, but who cares?
Yeah,
yeah. So that's the view they were trying to make, and then the revolution happened. I mean, it was infectious, the Arab Spring. It came to Syria, and at a certain point, unlike other states or other countries, we were affected differently for various reasons. Among them, the Russian supports for Assad. Among them, the lack of Israelis' interest in toppling Assad at the time. Anything better than chaos. There was different factors for explaining why the Syrian uprising went that long, but also I think one of the most important factors is that basically state actors or powerful states were playing in Syria by arming groups, Islamist and otherwise, not to topple Assad but to survive. So then you have, you prolong the conflict. You know this very well, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, I saw this, so from my perch in government. So I was a civil servant at the U.S. Department of Defense at the time, and I was actually covering the Syria file.
How many people were working in Syria desk in Pentagon? In
First, it was
White
just
House?
me.
I mean,
First, it was just me at the Pentagon, and then and then. But it was because we didn't have a military relationship with Syria, so it was a dormant file. But you had a team at the State Department, you had a team at the White House. But of course, as the conflict began, I end up leading a whole team of Syria
exactly. But before
analysts.
The conflict, it was you. And it's crazy, to think about this. The U.S. This is what the U.S. was basically thinking of Syria through one person, which is great. It's you, but there was no one with you.
So from 2008 to 2011, the Syria file was nothing. You didn't have much to do because there was no military to military relationship between the US and Syria. So it was really more like monitoring, what's going on and stuff like that, just keeping an eye out. And then the Arab Spring happened, 2011. It started out in Tunisia, and then it went over to Egypt, toppled the Tunisian leader, and then it went over to Egypt, it toppled Hosni Mubarak, which was, you remember at the time how it just, it was huge. I mean, as an Egyptian American, I remember Hosni Mubarak was the only president Egypt had ever known since I was born. And it was impossible that he would be toppled, but he was. The Egyptian revolution was this huge thing. And then it moved over to Syria. So that was about 2011, right? And when it first started out, Orwa, it wasn't necessarily a call for the removal of the regime. It was a call for economic, fairness. It was a call for just a better life, social justice, a better life. And then, goes back to what we were saying about the Orientalist view of, the desert rose and the family and all that stuff, that inside the US government and other Western governments, there was no preparation for what Assad was about to do to the Syrian people. Everyone thought he was this Western educated person and he wouldn't ever use force against his own people. And then he did, and it was the most brutal, worst kind of force. And I remember the picture of the little boy in Dara, Hamza al-Khatib, and his mutilated body, and that sparked the real revolution in Syria.
That's of course that's partly, I mean, because at the beginning they protested against Assad, and then security forces started killing people. It started in Daraa, as you said, before Hamza al-Khatib, actually, when those kids wrote some graffiti on the walls that "Ijak ad-Dor ya Doctor," like, it's your turn, doctor, to Bashar al-Assad. And then the way the security forces reacted, it was brutal. It was very insulting to the tribes. We have some stories coming from there that they humiliated the tribe's leader when they came to the prisons to ask for their kids. So they were humiliated. Their dignity was trashed by the security forces. So that's partly of it. And then it's just exploded in different places. And Assad was willing to do anything but to leave power. And then 2014, Assad was losing big time. And then Russia intervened. Iran was already intervening. And then this lasted until 2024. Assad's politically, I would argue he was dumb. I think he didn't know how to play politics. I mean, it's just like he's very stubborn. He doesn't know how to play politics. He's not willing to give any concessions. I don't know. Like, I was thinking just like, what school of politics he follows, like there was nothing.
It's interesting that you say that. I want to mention something, come back to something that you just said a little while ago, which is how there were a lot, once the revolution started, once the actual war started in Syria, for all of those years, all these foreign powers started intervening in Syria. Everyone picked their guy, everyone picked their side. You had money and weapons flowing in from the Gulf, from Turkey, the Americans, the Israelis, the Arabs, everybody had a piece, the Iranians, the Russians. And the general sense in the West and in Israel that no matter what Assad did, even when we saw the worst of what he did, those awful photos that were revealed by Caesar, which was this photographer that smuggled photos from Saidnaya prison, even when we saw the worst, that the general sense in the West was, but what's the alternative? At least he's the devil we know. And that was Assad's calculus, to answer your question. From my perspective, from where I was seeing it, that the world shunned Assad in 2005 after the assassination in Lebanon of the Prime Minister Rafi al-Hariri, which Assad was behind. And the world shunned him for years. But by 2008, 9, 10, he had sort of become rehabilitated. People have short memories. Policymakers have short memories. And so I think that by the time when things started to calm down in Syria, in the sense that you didn't really see it in the news anymore, there wasn't so much active fighting anymore, I think he thought, you know what, I'm going to ride this out. Time is on my side. And I think that's what made him arrogant in these negotiations, which sparked, that final push towards Damascus and the Turkish green light, basically, correct me if I'm wrong, to have those rebel forces start moving towards Damascus to overthrow him, is that he had been negotiating with the Turks over a balance of power, sort of carving out power in the northeast of Syria where the Turks have some influence, and he wouldn't budge. And the Turks got really impatient with him and his arrogance and just said, you know what, we're done with you.
Yeah, I think, mostly this is true. I just feel like if you think about the Turkish perspective, because you brought this now, Turkey's goal became the rebels' goal, which is topple Assad up until 2015-16, when the Russian changed the status quo on the ground, where they said, like, no, we are here, and guess what? We control the sky. And, we control the sky of Syria, and anything should go through us if you want, right? So you have two major powers in Syria, and Turkey had its concern with the Kurdish forces. But then Turkey changed its goal, basically from toppling Assad, that was 2016, into creating a safe zone to repatriate refugees, but also tackle the Kurdish threat. which is like, we don't want a Kurdish entity in our southern border. That's a red line, right? So that changed over time. But as you said, this is one, I think what you said, valid. I would also add to it, when it comes to Assad stubbornness, is that basically the policy, or like the way Assad's the father thought about politics, regional politics, and so on, is that basically wait and see. Like, you can wait and see, and if you look, you see that Assad's the father played similar game but smarter. He was willing to give concessions in return for other right, but Bashar was literally thinking about that. I'm not going to give any concession, because if I give today a concession, they will ask for more tomorrow. And that happened with, if you look at the Syrian Democratic Forces Damascus during the time of Assad's negotiation, which lasted between 2017 until 2024. Imagine, all the time they were speaking, there was like negotiation between the two parties, where Assad's always refusing to give any concession. We were also following, for example, Geneva talks and the Constitutional Committee's talks, like throughout the 2020s, where we got some sources in the meeting in Geneva saying like they are just putting sticks in the wheels. So they were just like, they don't want to negotiate. They see that they have to do it for the international community. And this applies to what you said about Turkey and Erdogan and Assad, where Erdogan was almost in every occasion telling him, let's meet, let's talk. But Assad was refusing completely, because at certain point, as you said, he realized that he is the least bad option, right?
The least worst option, yeah.
He was very stubborn. He was not playing politics. He was insisting that everyone needs me and no one is willing to sacrifice me, especially the Iranian with the Russians. I think the calculation at the time was like, guess what? They've invested in me so much. And I always give this metaphor. It's like Assad's for Russia and in Iran, in a way. It was like this teenage boy that you don't really like what he does, because he's like really feisty, naughty, but at the same time, he's your teenage. And I think that was like how I saw Assad for maybe 7-8 years, the way he was playing them out. It's crazy, like, especially the last couple of years when he was pivoting a little bit towards the Gulf, where he was, you saw this kind of rapprochement between UAE, they received him, Saudi Arabia the same way. So they were trying to contain him in a way, and he realized that very well. And this is where he was like, okay, I'm not going to meet Erdogan. This is where he pissed off the Iranians at the same time. They were like, we were supporting you all these years, and now you're abandoning us in the most critical moment in the war, right? So I think, he was the disobedient kid, I would say.
The disobedient child. I mean, it's so, it's true. It's true. The disobedient child that knows that he can get away with anything, basically. Okay, so fast forward now. So let's place ourselves in right before December 2024. So there had been about 13, 14 years of this war in Syria post-Arab Spring. We had seen the Russians supporting Bashar al-Assad to protect Russian interests in Syria, their naval base in Tartus, projecting power against the US and the Western world through Syria. You had Iran supporting Bashar al-Assad because they were using Syria as a way to support their proxies to send weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon through the land route of Syria, to project power as well vis-a-vis Israel. You had Israel, who liked the stability that Assad provided internationally, not locally, but they were like, Assad is not going to fight us. That's all we care about. All good. And of course during that period of time, you also had this terrible influence of the rise of ISIS, the takeover of ISIS in Raqqa in the northeast, the defeat of ISIS by the counter-ISIS coalition, and then moving on from that, now we are in December of 2024. As you said, some of the Arab countries have started warming up again to Assad, always with this sort of realpolitik that always ends up squashing any other concern, whether it's human rights or anything like that. This realpolitik, this very cold view of, well, he's the devil we know. We see that in so many countries around the world, and it anchors a lot of the Western and non-Western foreign policy, especially towards the Middle East, but also, of course, around the world. So then what happens in December 2024?
I think December 2024 was surprising for al-Sharaa himself. I would bet on this. I don't think the plan was to take over Damascus, and I think at the beginning they didn't acknowledge it. I mean, HTS and al-Sharaa, but by time it was very obvious, and they had to say that was not the plan, right?
So HTS, just so everyone knows, just explain what HTS and Ahmed al-Sharaa are before we go into his current role as president.
Yeah. So very quickly, HTS is Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, the Committee for Liberating al-Sham. Al-Sham historically is the region of Damascus, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. So basically, like, this is the idea of it, because it was a jihadi groups, and then it transformed itself into a local Islamist group. It originated in 2011 as a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, and basically it was established by the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI. Then April 2013, there was a split. There was actually divorce from the Islamic State in Iraq, and al-Sharaa at the time, instead of moving into the local focus, he joined al-Qaeda. So he left ISIS and he joined al-Qaeda, and then in 2014, intra-jihadi war started between him and ISIS. 2016, he decided to divorce al-Qaeda and to announce himself as a local Islamist jihadist group. It depends how you define both terms. Since 2017, he started to focus on Syria, not to be only a military jihadi groups like the classical one that moves from jihadi arena to another, but also as a local actors that provide governance, social services, and it embeds itself within the social Syrian fabrics. And this is what he did up until December 2014.
And he was governing Idlib.
In northwest Syria, part of northwest Syria, Idlib and its environs, and it basically he had control over more than 4 million people at the time.
And that's huge, because as you and I have talked about before, he had been so opaque for so many years, during his years, ISIS and then al-Qaeda, and then the head of HTS in Syria as a local militant, but then when HTS was governing, that was really when we saw what his style of governance might, looking back at it in hindsight, when we look at his style of governance now, which I know we'll get into, that's when he started becoming less opaque, more transparent in the way that he, we start now to have an idea of, all right, what is this guy's approach? How does he approach rivals? How does he approach governance? Is he cooperative and collaborative? Is he authoritarian? So that glimpse of his past in a governance perspective helps shed some light on his governance style now, some of the decisions that he's been taking since he led the toppling of Assad, then became president, and also gives us a glimpse of what how he might address future challenges that Syria might be facing.
Indeed, that's a good point to think of. There was like different line of reportings. There was like the local line of reportings, which is basically talking about how al-Sharaa consolidated his rules by sidelining other factions, by dominating over the military scene, by creating the Salvation Governance, which is basically his political wing. And then there is another line of reportings that is not local reportings, which talks about al-Sharaa as an example of a jihadi, of like, it's an ideal type of how a jihadi can turn into a local leader. And look, it's great. It's amazing. They have internet on the bus stations. They have, most of the city has electricity 24 hours. So like, it's very superficial in a way, but
Yeah.
but at the same time, it made sense. Like if you don't go deeper, if you don't talk to a lot of locals there outside the city itself, you will hear a different story. But if you keep like looking at what they are doing, so he went to a restaurant, he served food for someone. Does the jihadi do that? No, he's not a jihadi. I think the idea of like, you are either a jihadi to be bad, and you cannot be bad if you're not a jihadi. That's really flawed argument. Assad was not a jihadi, right? He was bad.
Yeah.
So I think it's just the idea that jihadi shouldn't be the criteria. It is a criteria. If he's a transnational jihadi, he wants to harm people and use violence against civilians and so on and so forth, there's definitely something here. But again, it's not enough criteria which we should base our analysis on. So if that's a point I'm trying to make here. And then I go back to the governance style. So 2016, but of course, before that, Sharaa fought with a nationalist group. Sharaa fought with ISIS. Sharaa fought with other Islamist group. 2016, they took Idlib with the coalition of Islamist group and others called Jaish al-Fatah, which was the biggest military umbrella. And it seems that there was like an agreement, international agreement, I would say, like, between mainly Turkey, Qatar, and UAE, maybe, or Saudi Arabia, to support this umbrella to topple Assad. They took Idlib 2015, 2016, they are there. And then al-Sharaa was supposed part of this military coalition. He saw that Ahrar al-Sham, one of the biggest group at the time, is much more popular. It has its root base in Idlib and other places. Remember, he has a lot of foreign fighters, right? And
That's
these,
right.
Ahrar al-Sham is very local. But again, al-Nusra managed to win the heart and minds of civilians because it was very effective. It was very disciplined. Forget about him personally. The group itself was really effective, and people loved it for at least until 2014. He kicked Ahrar Sham out of Bab al-Hawa crossing. That was like the main issue here, where he controlled Idlib. He promised them that he will establish a civilian directorship for the crossing, so no factions will control it. But of course, it was him who controlled it. He then created the Salvation Government, which is basically, it's the political wing of HTS. It was comprised of technocrat, semi-technocrat people. Most of them, they were really part of what they were doing. So you have like an academic running the Ministry of Education, and then but it was very limited. That describing it as a government is a pretty much like an overstatement.
Yeah.
It was like an administration in a way, right?
Yeah, administration. Administrative structure, I guess.
Exactly. Because guess what, Jasmine? Many of the big sectors were run by NGOs. So I'll give you an example, like say health sector. Health sector was basically run by international NGOs, but then HTS was regulating this work. So if you go to the Ministry of Health now, I mean, I don't think it exists anymore, but in the Salvation Government, you wouldn't find anything. They haven't done anything big. They were basically regulating this. Education sector, the same thing. What I'm trying to say is that he controlled Idlib in terms of like governance. And of course, he dominated the military scene because no military faction was able to challenge him. He left a few factions who operated under HTS. And then he created the general security apparatus, which is the iron fist of him, and which protected him against internal power struggle, demonstrations, which it was basically a coup-proof for him. But at the same time, so we have this security apparatus which is cracking on people, not only people like, his opposition, but at the same time, back to your point about realpolitik, guess what? He is fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And he is, if you think about like, this equation that do you prefer security or democracy? Like, it's like this binary, like
that
and then
age-old question.
Yeah, and I don't think that's like the question in Idlib. It's just like it was like less repression, maybe, right? But again, you see this 4 million people living there. You rarely hear about them, these refugees, trying to go to Turkey, because guess what? al-Sharaa is much more a reliable partner for Turkey than the Syrian National Army, which it has been funded supporting for years. So al-Sharaa was like presenting himself as a viable option, as a partner for Turkey, for NATO, for the US, that, okay, I will help you with fighting ISIS. I will help you with fighting Al-Qaeda. I will make sure that no refugees will come from this area to Turkey, right? But guess what? I'll run this administration the way I want to.
It's interesting. Okay, so what I'm getting from what you're describing is pragmatism coupled with heavy-handedness when need be, coupled with diplomacy, knowing when to, knowing how to position yourself so that stronger actors don't see you as a problem. So that's a very interesting mix for someone who started out as a fighter, in Iraq against the US occupation, all the way to becoming the administrator of a large city in Syria. So then take us back to the days and hours before the toppling of Assad. It was obviously from an outside perspective, it was shocking. I mean, it was as if you just woke up one day, rebel forces were advancing on Damascus, and then 2 days later, I was in Doha in December, so at this, foreign policy conference, and there were tons of Syrians there, and the Russian foreign minister was there as well, Sergei Lavrov, and we're all watching. I mean, it was this 48 hours of intense lightning advance towards Damascus. And I remember the day people, of course, are watching this, all these Syrians who have been, fighting against Assad, fighting for democracy, fighting to reclaim their country. A lot of them had been exiled for over a decade. And everybody's watching this. And then the day before Assad falls, I'm watching a panel, an interview between an Al Jazeera English presenter and Sergei Lavrov. And the presenter asks Lavrov, it's a public thing, so I can say this. He asks Lavrov, have you checked in on Bashar al-Assad? I mean, how is he feeling? Essentially, are you going to step in and save him? Like you did in 2016. So Lavrov just looks very coolly at the audience and says, we are not in the business of checking in on people's feelings.
But that's really reflects Russia's position in the world.
Exactly. And that's when people were like, oh, wow, I don't think the Russians are going to save him this time. He's just become too much of a burden, and it's just too much. And sure enough, the next day, he was gone.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think like regionally, geopolitically, it was a really good moment. Like the time they decided the operation, like repel the aggression, it was very good opportunity. Think about it like this: ceasefire in Lebanon, right, between Israel and Hezbollah. So it was that moment where if you allow Hezbollah to regroup, and if you carry an operation against the Syrian regime, Hezbollah might intervene. So now Hezbollah is received this big blow, take advantage of it. So this is one element, I guess. The second element, the operation didn't mean, like, was not supposed to topple Assad. The operation, I mean, even its name, repel the aggression. I've talked to HTS people, like, at the time. It was basically to take a military base that I think around 20 kilometers east of Idlib, where the regime was using to attack Idlib. So that was like the first goal, short goal. The second goal was basically to take Aleppo. And if you take Aleppo, this is where Turkey played a role, Turkey would make sure that the regime did not maybe commit massacres against Aleppo if HTS managed to control Aleppo. So basically they were like, if we get into Aleppo, we can protect Aleppo with the help of Turkey, with the help of the international community, and they just went there and they found the regime collapsed. And of course they fought at the beginning, and then they had behind the lines operations. Definitely, that's true. Yeah, but Aleppo, when he went to Aleppo castle, like al-Sharaa himself, it was a clear indication that the man didn't fear anything. Like, he went there and it was clear that the regime was collapsing just hour by hour, right? And back to your point about the Russians, basically, I remember that it was, I think, in Homs, when the rebels were in Homs. Basically, the Russian targeted Talbise, which is Homs countryside. And Talbise was basically like the last point where the Russians tried to intervene to save the regime. Afterwards, Bloomberg, wrote this. I think it's from a Russian source. We're saying we cannot protect a leader where his army is running away or like fleeing.
And that's a really important point, Orwa, here, because there's a reason why the regime collapsed so quickly in the face of this. The Russians didn't put all their weight on it, but also Bashar al-Assad himself had not been taking care of the military. I mean, maybe this was arrogance, maybe it was lack of resources, but it was hollow, really. It was really just a facade. So by the time these rebel forces were, yes, of course, some of the military, tried to fight back or put up a fight, but it collapsed like a house of cards because it was hollow. People weren't getting paid. Soldiers weren't getting paid. Salaries were not enough for them. I mean, it was a facade, really, which is what we learned, during this onslaught. So they go in, they're expecting, they have these military objectives: secure the military base, secure Aleppo, and then all of a sudden they find the regime just collapses, and then they just go. What happens then?
I mean, they didn't reach Damascus. It was the military factions from the south, from Daraa. They got into Damascus before them, and they took control over the palace, and Assad had gone by that time. But then, of course, al-Sharaa and his people started to promote. Of course, like, one important factor here is that al-Sharaa changed his name on the way. Like, he was in Homs.
Exactly.
He was moving to Damascus, and then he decided, I can't run Syria by Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. I am Ahmed al-Sharaa, and I'm gonna change the discourse of the group.
You can't make this up. It's like a movie. Like, literally, like, on route to Damascus, he changes his name from Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani to Ahmed al-Sharaa in preparation for this new person that he's about to become.
Yeah, definitely. That's completely true. I mean, they convinced basically the Daraa faction that, we are coming with a big army and don't try us out because, it's gonna be bloody, but we will take over. So the South, probably with some advice from Jordan, South factions decided to, allow HTS to come to power. Of course, along the way, they were talking about 2254, which is the UN resolution about Syria that was put together 2012 maybe, which is basically stipulates that the Syrian opposition will negotiate with the Syrian regime at the time, create transitional government, and so on and so forth. Of course, Sharaa was like, yes, we want to play 2254. And then when he came to the palace, he was like, 2254 is ridiculous. I mean, it stipulates that we need to sit with Assad. Shall we go to Moscow and sit with Assad? It doesn't work, right? So he came to Damascus, and then it was big confusion, Jasmine. Like, it was confusion for them, for their support base, for their fighters. And I mean, let's remember, so the coalition that made it to Damascus, or like at least that made it to Aleppo, was basically HTS supported by few factions that are supported by Turkey, but they operate under HTS in a way or another. So HTS took the lead in this operation. And then, yeah, they didn't know how to deal with it. They were like, what the heck? Like, we don't know what this is. Syria, like, it's so big, and we don't know what to do with it. We were running al-Kayan al-Sunni, the Sunni entity, like that's, we talked about it before, is that basically HTS legitimacy rests on the idea that we are protecting Sunnis from the Alawites, from the existential, like it's an existential threat on Sunnis, and HTS or Idlib is the place where Sunnis can be protected and feel safe, right? So Idlib wasn't for all Syrians. Idlib was for Sunnis and
under HTS. So this is important to kind of clarify here for a second, is that Bashar al-Assad and his family were Alawites. And so Alawites were sort of the protected class, if you will, under the government, or privileged, I would say, in terms of government jobs. I say this in a sense of, because I also want to be very careful about not talking about Syria in sectarian language. What I mean to say is that the Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad before him tried to create those divisions. So I had mentioned a tapestry of people living in Syria, and when the Assad regime came in, first the father, then the son, their power was in dividing and conquering. So privileging some Alawites, privileging some Sunni businessmen to keep them on their side, really sidelining the Kurds, in the north. So I say this, why do I say this, is because when you and I start talking about some of the awful incidents that we've been seeing in the last few months since al-Sharaa came to power, that it's, I think, important to keep in perspective that for a very long time, the ruling government in Syria tried to divide and conquer Syrians against one another.
I agree. That's a great point. I think blaming al-Sharaa for the sectarian elements of what's happening in Syria is unfair. Like, al-Sharaa didn't invent sectarianism, he capitalized on it. Like, he didn't come with the idea that I'm going to use it. No, but it was there, so he used it. However, I slightly disagree with the characterization that Alawites were privileged. I think Alawites are as marginalized as many Sunnis in the rural areas. But there's something that some Syrian intellectual called political Alawism, which is basically there is this strata of people, that Alawites and otherwise, who are close to the regime. The regime instrumentalized sectarianism. I mean, but again, it's not al-Sharaa who invented this. And also Alawites, they fought this war because it was presented to them, framed to them as an existential threat to them, because they are, a minority, small sect that also has been under threat historically from the Sunni majority, right? So in a way, most of them were not like really privileged in a sense that they were getting a lot of money or like they were businessmen. I don't think this is the case. The case was pretty much like Assad's, they are the backbone of the security forces. And the security forces, it's not all of them, or like the majority of them, are just soldiers in a way. They brought them, they give them monthly salary, they give them a power, right? So they are privileged to use their power as security forces because everyone is afraid from security force in Syria, right? But if you look about them, they are not better educated than Sunnis. They are not better privileged financially, all of them. But definitely they were the backbone of the security forces and the military, and therefore there was this backlash against them.
Yeah, so I'm glad you clarified that. So that the privilege was that Assad surrounded himself with members of that community, and they were privileged in that sense, but that the community as a whole was not privileged, and in fact had reason to feel very insecure and very threatened by other factions in this atmosphere of weaponized sectarianism. And so in that context of weaponized sectarianism, what you're talking about Ahmed al-Sharaa being the protector of the Sunnis in Idlib, that was in the context of a weaponized sectarianism where every community in Syria felt like they had to protect their backs, that they had to protect their own, and that they were under existential threat from other factions. And of course, you had that ISIS, umbrella threat also, which threatened everybody pretty much. And back to December, so the regime falls unexpectedly, and Assad basically left under the cover of darkness. He didn't tell anyone that he was leaving. He didn't even tell his own brother. He didn't tell Buthayna Sha'ban, one of his top aides who had been with him since the beginning. In fact, I read that he had called an emergency meeting at his house, and when people arrived, he was gone. It was just absolutely crazy. So he flees like a coward in the middle of the night, not telling anybody. And then you have this atmosphere where after decades of conflict, war, torture, fear, weaponized sectarianism, exile, refugees, internally displaced people, now you have this group of rebels basically standing in the presidential palace going, whoa, what now?
That was a big question. I mean, the confusion was very clear in the sense that, for the first day, the prime minister of the Salvation government, who became the prime minister of the caretaking government, right? This was on the 8th of December. So immediately, al-Sharaa changed his name, brought his crew from Idlib, like the Salvation government, and he told them, now you are running Syria. So the first meeting, the first public appearance of the prime minister, he had the revolution flag behind him and HTS flag behind him. And
I remember.
It was like very much like, what shall we do now?
They're literally figuring it out as they go along.
It was really difficult position for all of them. They didn't know how to deal with it. And of course, I think what was really promising about the whole operation, you must give them the credit for it, is that it was more or less white operation. Like there was no blood. It wasn't bloody. So we had this moment of hope of, wow, like what happened to the 14 years of rage, of grief, so we were really surprised. But when they came to power and then al-Sharaa started to realize that, what shall I do now is that basically I want to do exactly the opposite of what Assad used to do. So what I'm going to do is allow people to speak, is I'm going to try to bring everyone to the table, at least nominally. It's a honeymoon. I am the liberator. I gained a lot of supports because remember, many of the Syrians, they barely knew about al-Jolani's existence. Like they were just following Idlib from afar. They say like in Idlib, there is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. His Qaeda, his ISIS, we don't care. He's in Idlib. So this guy liberated Syria. He came to power and then this is where he started. Okay, now I have Syria and I have to rule Syria. I have to get the international community recognition. And now they have to accept me because I'm ruling Syria. And that goes to the question of international community and how pragmatic they can be.
We're going to get to U.S. policy and this whole devil we know mentality that continues to pervade U.S. policy. We're going to get into that. My initial thought was, I've seen this before. God, I've heard this before. 8 years in the Obama administration. I've heard this before. What is the alternative? The opposition is too disjointed. Who else can we support? There has been, after a period of deliberation by the international community after December 2024, the international community has made a decision to open up to Ahmed al-Sharaa. And the danger of saying right from the get-go, there is no other option, is that it lets him off the hook at a time when he really needs to be held accountable, because the decisions that are being made today in Syria are going to impact Syria, I think, for decades to come. So on the flip side, though, you also have to be you also have to be careful about the opposite end of that spectrum, which is the U.S. saying, "Oh, we don't like Sharaa, let's push him out, get the next guy in." So of course you have to balance. Of course, this is a president now. This is a president, and he is the president of Syria. And there's no you hear people saying, oh, they still refer to him as al-Qaeda. They still refer to him as a jihadist. And guess what? He's the president, and it is in the interests of Syria and Syrians for him to be assisted and helped in getting this right, and even pressured if need be to get this right. But Syrians, have been through so much for so long. And I remember when I was in Doha and I was surrounded by all these Syrians who, the emotion and the joy and the tears, and just Assad is gone. Finally, he's gone. And I remember someone posting on Twitter, which I just found so touching, where she said, I'm not a Syrian refugee anymore. I'm just Syrian. It was Sarah Hunaidi, who... I mean, my heart, is just like, most of us don't know how that feels to be in exile from your homeland for decades, and then to finally see the dictator toppled and to just be like, I can go home again. I am Syrian again. We are Syrian again. It was such a beautiful moment. And so Syria, and so to see now that initial sense of you, and of course, not everybody was just purely euphoric. I mean, some people were apprehensive, some people wanted to wait and see, some people were afraid. But after everything that Syrians have been through, I think to see what's happening now it really makes you think, no, I mean, not again. He has to get it right. And if he's the president, we have to support him in getting it right. But I'm curious, Orwa, because I didn't ask you about this, and I really feel like it's important. I mean, how did you feel? You're Syrian. I mean, how did you feel at that moment?
I think I'm Syrian, and also I am an analyst. So there was this strange moment where I was giving interviews when I think the last interview I gave when they were in Homs. And when the Russian bombarded Telbise, I was like, this is not gonna happen, but the Russian is gonna ruin everything now. Like they bombarded Homs countryside, and I was like no, just leave, let it be, I was torn about this. So it was just a great moment. And I think up until Homs, I wasn't getting enough sleep. And then I slept and I woke up, and then I found, like many Syrians, maybe 10 text messages or more, wake up, Assad just fled. And that was I think, I don't know, I don't think there's a better moment. There was more glorious or memorable moment in my life more than this, because, you've been working on this, you've been seeing this, you've been seeing what he has been doing. And then at some point you want him to leave. And then, yeah, it just happened. Of course, there was concerns also about the violence that might ensue, but then everything proved us wrong as analysts at the moment. There was no violence. Yeah, at the time.
Yeah, at the time. I mean, I remember people in the streets and people taking photographs with the armed fighters and, al-Sharaa, all of the sudden celebrity status, girls, wanting to take pictures next to him and stuff like that. So that was the initial moment of euphoria. And he was saying a lot of the right things, and he was talking about inclusivity and talking about, all of this stuff. And then March 2025, the Alawite massacre on the coast. Make sure to tune in next week for part 2 of my conversation with Orwa. And in the meantime, please don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to this YouTube channel, leave a review to tell us what you're thinking, and of course, you can always email us with your thoughts at viewfromherepod@gmail.com. That's viewfromherepod@gmail.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine Al-Gamal, and this is The View From Here.